Lesson 3 of Outsmarting Anti-Semitism, where we will focus on the anti-Semitism as it relates to the Holy Land of Israel, the Promised Land. And this is really a modern form of anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism always was, as we've discussed the past two classes, anti-Semitism is an ancient form of hate. And this unique form of anti-Semitism is modern. It's an attempt to destroy or weaken the state of Israel, God forbid, which really in turn threatens the well-being and the safety of millions of Jews who live in the Holy Land. And so the reality is that today, much of anti-Semitic activity, not all of it, of course not, but much of it does revolve around this tiny country called Israel. This idea is not a new idea. It's something which has been around. In other words, anti-Semitism with a unique focus on a specific aspect has been around for thousands of years. And the question really is, why? Why is there so much hatred centered on Israel? This is a little bit of a long video, but I thought it was something important to begin with to give us a certain perspective on how much Israel is hated and on what scope Israel is hated. Sorry, just a moment.
On the eastern shore of Manhattan Island, the United Nations headquarters rises from a row of colored flags that represent a multitude of nations. Across the avenue, the Isaiah Wall proclaims a Jewish prophet's vision of universal peace. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. The UN's mission is precisely that, to resolve armed conflicts and to foster global harmony. But inside the august chambers of the United Nations, founded in 1945 as a response to a war-ravaged world desperate for coexistence, Isaiah could have easily found himself the target of virulent condemnation had he survived into modern times. Isaiah lived in ancient Israel, that for over a millennia included the territories that the UN considers illegally occupied by today's Jewish state. The Temple Mount that lies at the heart of Isaiah's prophecy is no longer considered by the UN to be the heritage or possession of the Jewish people. Indeed, the tiny country that Isaiah called home has become the focus of the majority of the UN's denunciations and has inspired more censure than all of today's tyrants put together. Iran, North Korea, and other brutal regimes systematically kill their citizens or deny them the most basic of human rights. Israel's northern neighbor, Syria, has murdered tens of thousands of innocent civilians. Apparently, however, that isn't very important in the eyes of the UN General Assembly and Security Council, who continually pass one-sided resolutions that single out and condemn Israel. An overwhelmingly powerful bloc led by the Arab nations promotes a narrow and slanderous agenda meant to isolate Israel. This agenda has met little resistance. The UN's General Assembly votes on 70 to 100 resolutions annually. 15 to 20 of these regularly express disapproval of Israel. From 2016 until 2020, the Assembly adopted 122 resolutions criticizing various countries. 91 of these targeted Israel. That's 75% of all country-specific resolutions. And while 3/4 of this global forum's written rage lambastes the Jewish state, precious few of the most repressive or blood-soaked regimes on earth have received even a single rebuke. Emergency special sessions of the Assembly are rare. During the last 40 years, they've been convened for one purpose only: to condemn Israel. The Assembly's embrace of a terrorist entity has been equally astounding. In October 1974, 14 years before the Palestinian Liberation Organization even nominally forswore terrorism. The Assembly voted to invite a PLO spokesman to take part in its deliberations. This was the first time that anyone who was neither a government representative nor a head of a quasi-state was granted such a privilege. The following year, the Assembly awarded the PLO permanent representative status. A few months later, the UN infamously approved Resolution 3379, branding Zionism as a form of racism. At the time, Israel's UN ambassador, Chaim Herzog, told his fellow delegates that Hitler would have felt at home listening to the UN debate on the measure.
For us, the Jewish people, this is no more than a piece of paper, and we shall treat it as such.
Since the 1993 Oslo Accords, hundreds of Israelis have been killed and thousands injured by Palestinian terror attacks. During the same period, the UN passed dozens of resolutions deploring Israel, but not one against the terror attacks. Since the 2006 creation of the UN's Human Rights Council, most of the world's human rights abusers have suffered nary a mild rebuke. Israel, on the other hand, is chastised as often as all of the rest of the countries combined, and in terms more condemnatory. At the Council's every meeting, a topic billed as, quote, human rights situation in Palestine and other occupied Arab territories, is raised as a separate agenda item, while the remaining totality of mankind constitutes a single other point on the agenda. From 2006 to May 2021, Israel was condemned in no less than 94 Human Rights Council resolutions. During the same period, Syria was condemned 36 times, North Korea 14 times, and China has been spared condemnation altogether. Even within the walls of the UN, the absurdity of its anti-Israel bias is fleetingly, partially acknowledged. In September 2006, UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan conceded.
Supporters of Israel feel that it is harshly judged by standards that are not applied to its enemies. And too often this is true, particularly in some UN bodies.
In August 2013, UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon reflected on Israel's treatment at the UN.
There are some bias against the Israeli people and government.
In December 2016, he told the UN Security Council,
A disproportionate volume of resolutions, reports, and conferences criticizing Israel.
One of the more telling comments came inadvertently in November 2013, when a UN interpreter failed to silence her microphone as she addressed her colleague.
I mean, I think when you have 5 statements, not 5, like a total of 10 resolutions on Israel and Palestine, there's got to be something. C'est un peu trop, no? I mean, I know it's yes, it's right, but it's not there's other really bad happening. Nobody says anything about the other stuff. Apologies.
Okay, I understand there was a problem with interpretation.
Israel is not larger than 8,019 square miles in total. It is the Middle East's only functioning democracy and champion of human rights. It is a world provider of humanitarian disaster relief and medical, agricultural, ecological, scientific, technological, and security innovations. But when seen through the lens of historical UN bias, the overwhelming majority of all the world's evils and all of the world's ills belong to the tiny Jewish homeland in which Isaiah spoke his vision of swords being beaten into plowshares.
So we're a hated people, and it's quite powerfully so in the UN, which is supposed to be a place that is there for all people and to help all people. But this idea of focusing on anti-Semitism in a very narrow form, in a very unique form, is nothing new. It's been around for thousands of years, and it's put succinctly so, and in a very powerful statement by the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks in text 1 on page 84. Shmuel, can you please read for us text 1 on page 84?
A mutating virus. Anti-Semitism is not an ideology, a coherent set of beliefs. It is, in fact, an endless stream of contradictions. The best way of understanding it is to see it as a virus. Viruses attack the human body, but the body itself has an immensely sophisticated defense, the human immune system. How then do viruses survive and flourish? By mutating. Anti-Semitism mutates, and in so doing, defeats the immune systems set up by cultures to protect themselves against hatred. Most people, at most times, feel a residual guilt at hating the innocent. Therefore, anti-Semitism has always had to find legitimation in the most prestigious source of authority at any given time. In the first centuries of the Common Era, and again in the Middle Ages, this was religion. That is why Judophobia took the form of religious doctrine. In the 19th century, religion had lost prestige, and the supreme authority was now science. Racial anti-Semitism was duly based on two pseudosciences: social Darwinism, the idea that in a society as in nature, the strong survive by eliminating the weak, and the so-called scientific study of race. By the late 20th century, science had lost its prestige, having given us the power to destroy life on Earth. Today, the supreme source of legitimacy is human rights. That is why Jews, or the Jewish state, are accused of the 5 primal sins against human rights: racism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, attempted genocide, and crimes against humanity. Wow.
They've always looked for what was the most respected idea, what was the preeminent authority of its time. When it was religion, we were blamed that we were going against their religion. When it was science, we were blamed that we were going against the scientific understanding of the greatness of the human race. And now when it's human rights, they're blaming the Jews for any human rights violation. We have to somehow zero in and say that Israel is at fault, and by Israel, they mean the entirety of the Jewish people, as we shall soon see, is at fault for transgressing the most atrocious human rights possible. And it's important to note that that doesn't mean that everything that Israel does cannot be criticized. That doesn't mean that we have to agree with everything that the Israeli government does. As a matter of fact, as you see on page 87, most Jews actually are pro-Israel. 92% of American Jewry are generally pro-Israel, but many of them are critical of Israeli policies. And there's nothing wrong with that, with being critical of Israeli policies, whether it's one policy, 10 policies, or 98% of the policies. But there's a stark difference between legitimate criticism of the Jewish-controlled government's policies and criticism which is motivated by hatred of the Jews. How would we differentiate between legitimate criticism and anti-Semitism? One formula which gives us tools to differentiate between hatred versus legitimate criticism is actually found in a passage of a midrash. And the passage of the midrash tells us of an incident that occurred during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, and he ruled in the 2nd century, ruled over Israel. He was brutal against the Jews in the Holy Land. He was brutal against the Jews wherever they were, and he enacted many, many laws to weaken Judaism. And the Midrash records how someone spoke truth to power and spoke to calling out Hadrian's double standard. Rachel, can you please read for us text 2 on page 88?
Sure. Double standard. Imachantron wrote to Emperor Hadrian, if it is circumcision that you hate, Arabian tribes also circumcise. If it is Shabbat observance that you despise, the Kuthians similarly observe Shabbat. Clearly, then, you simply hate the Jewish people. Their God will exact punishment from you.
Thank you. So it's the same old complaint. Here was Hadrian, who was blaming it on human rights. Circumcision is brutal, and keeping Shabbos is being lazy, and so we have to do away with circumcision and Shabbos. The problem is there were other people who circumcised their children, and there were other people who kept Shabbos, and he had no issue with what they were doing. The problem was that it was the Jewish people who were doing it. And Imachantron, which we don't know much about him or who he was, if he was Jewish, if he wasn't Jewish, but we do know that Hadrian was furious about this letter that he had received from this individual, and he tried to track him down in order to execute him, but he had no way of finding him. And so in modern context, we see a lot of people and a lot of organizations that accuse Israel of human rights violations, but consistently give a pass to other people, what's going on in other places, other nations, other countries doing worse, way worse, to other things that Israel does, whether or not we agree with them. We're not going to get into the details of the complaints here, but suffice it to say that no one says anything else about the other people who are doing the same thing that Israel is being attacked for. And Nathan Sharansky, who we quoted in an earlier class, I think it was the first lesson, we had a video about him, and he himself experienced anti-Semitism. So he writes that he has a 3D test to see if people who are calling out Israel, are they doing it because they have legitimate concerns about Israel and legitimate criticism, or is it as a result of being a blatant anti-Semite? Page 89, text 3. Nathan Sharansky writes as follows. I believe that we can apply a simple test. I call it the 3D test to help us distinguish legitimate criticism of Israel from anti-Semitism. The first D is the test of demonization. When the Jewish state is being demonized, when Israel's actions are blown out of all sensible proportion, when comparisons are made between Israelis and Nazis and between Palestinian refugee camps and Auschwitz, this is anti-Semitism, not legitimate criticism of Israel. The second D is the test of double standards. When criticism of Israel is applied selectively, when Israel is singled out by the United Nations for human rights abuses while the behavior of known and major abusers, such as China, Iran, Cuba, and Syria, is ignored, when Israel's Magen David Adom, alone among the world's ambulance services, is denied admission to the International Red Cross, this is anti-Semitism. The third D is the test of delegitimization. When Israel's fundamental right to exist is denied, alone among all peoples in the world, this too is anti-Semitism. So next time we hear someone calling out Israel, whether it's an individual, it's a country, it's a people, it's a leader, let's analyze these 3Ds and see, does it pass the 3D test, or are they simply anti-Semites? And the question really is, now that we have a better understanding of what is Israel-related anti-Semitism, the question really is, what can we do about it? Is there something we can do about it? How do we go about it? So obviously, first and foremost, we have to do our part in supporting Israel, in strengthening Israel. And again, that does not mean not criticizing its policies. We can rightfully criticize its policies when we feel that, right, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. There are many people, and the Knesset is one of the places where there's robust discussion. If you've ever watched a session of the Knesset, where there's within the government, there's people that criticize its own government constantly, regularly. But overall, we have to be there to support the country. We have to be there to support the Jews that live there, support the army, support those who are supporting the land of Israel. But tonight we're going to focus on the second level of what we can do in regard to this level of anti-Semitism. And that is education associated with Israel, and we'll get to that in a minute. Aside from supporting Israel on a literal level, being their vocal support, there's also the spiritual endeavors that we spoke about last week to support Israel, adding another mitzvah, doing more studying of more Torah, as we explained in lesson 1, that the real source of our security comes from God, and therefore we have to engage in spiritual endeavors to help protect our brothers and sisters in the Holy Land, which is why, for example, in our shul, every Shabbos after the services, we always announce to say a psalm of Tehillim to strengthen the safety and security of the Jews in the Holy Lands. But the issue that we're going to focus on tonight is the issue that really, really concerns us. And that is when we find that aside from the general concept of anti-Semitism being painful, anti-Semitism being something which we've all experienced on various levels and we know is real, and we've discussed it in the past 2 sessions, but there's something which is somewhat even more painful about the Israel-focused anti-Semitism, and that is the fact that too many Jews, and particularly young Jews, have joined forces with the haters. Too many Jews demonize Israel with a double standard and even delegitimize its continued existence. And the problem with that is that when Jews join forces with the haters, it gives legitimacy and strength to the haters. And the question is why? Why is this happening? Why are there so many Jews joining forces with the haters? And what can we do to prevent it? And the answer is, as is everything in our life, as King Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun. These 2 ideas of anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism that we discussed up until now in lessons 1 and 2, and the anti-Semitism of Israeli-focused anti-Semitism, which unfortunately many Jews are joining, both these types of anti-Semitism have already occurred in history. And what am I talking about? The first type of anti-Semitism, first form, is called Haman anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism that took place on Purim. How did the anti-Semitism express itself? Traditional anti-Semitism, right? Traditional anti-Semitism, kill the Jews. The age-old form of anti-Semitism, let's annihilate the Jews. That was the ancient form, and the modern embodiment of that was the Nazis. May their name be erased. Just annihilate the Jews, the final solution. Would a Jew consider joining forces with that type of anti-Semitism? No, obviously you had 1 or 2 that's the anomaly, it's something which is the unthinkable. Because to kill the Jews, no, God forbid. And so we didn't have the masses of Jews joining such a form of anti-Semitism, the Purim anti-Semitism, the Haman anti-Semitism of Jewish annihilation. And then we have the second form of anti-Semitism. That is the Hanukkah anti-Semitism, the Antiochus anti-Semitism. Antiochus was the ruler of the Syrian Greeks at the time of the Hanukkah story. What was the Hanukkah story? Antiochus Epiphanes, he ruled roughly the 2nd century before the Common Era, and he did not seek to annihilate the Jews. On the contrary, he tried to support the Jews in general. He didn't even want to ban all of Judaism. Rather, there were certain beliefs and specific practices amongst the Jews that ran counter to the right way, to the accepted norm, to the accepted civilization of the time, which was Hellenism. And so to the Hellenist mind that worshiped the image of the human body, circumcision was outright barbaric. The observance of Shabbos was also despised because it promotes laziness. It goes against the right way of Hellenism. And so how could Jews refuse to build a Greek gymnasium in Jerusalem and to introduce the Greek way of educating children? We just want to make you better. We don't want to get rid of you. We're here to help you. And so when Antiochus Epiphanes went to war against the Jewish people, It wasn't against the Jewish people, it was against certain aspects of Judaism. And guess what? There were Jews who joined. There were many Jews who joined because they wanted to be part of this attractive, cutting-edge Hellenist society, and the only way they can do it is if they accept the values and the arguments of the Hellenists. They remain Jews, some cases even proud Jews, but they renounced the aspects of Judaism that went against the right way, the way of Hellenism. In their minds, they were saving Judaism. They were saving the Jews. They were freeing the Jews from the negative forces within Judaism. And as a matter of fact, some of them even supported Antiochus when he resorted to barbaric and ways of torture and killing Jews to force them into following Hellenism. And for this, it was easy for Jews to join because they didn't have to renounce Judaism. It sounded like they were saving Judaism, and they were part of a sophisticated worldview. It didn't feel like anti-Semitism. And this idea is presented quite powerfully in an article from the Tablet magazine, text 4, page 91. Ben, can you read for us text 4 on page 91?
Yes. Two forms of anti-Semitism. Hanukkah anti-Semitism doesn't demand dead or expelled Jews, at least not at first. Instead, it demands the destruction of Jewish civilization. This process requires not dead Jews, but Jews who are willing to give up whatever specific aspect of Jewish civilization is deemed to be uncool. Of course, Judaism has always been uncool, which is why cool people find it so threatening, and why Jews who are willing to become cool are absolutely necessary to Hanukkah-style anti-Semitism's success. In the days of Antiochus, this type of anti-Semitism needed those boys who voluntarily underwent painful genital surgery to prove that Jews weren't the problem, just the barbarity of Jewish law. Hanukkah-style anti-Semitism always promises Jews a kind of nobility, offering them the opportunity to cleanse themselves of whatever the people around them happen to find revolting. The Jewish traits designated as repulsive vary by country and by time period, but they invariably contradict the specific values that the surrounding culture has embraced as universal. Judaism's inherent uncoolness, there will never be a shortage of Jews willing to comply.
Thank you. And so in some progressive circles today, and especially on college campuses, a prevailing cutting-edge philosophy similar to those times, it sees the West as an imperialist, oppressive force that exploits disadvantaged indigenous peoples and racial minorities. And Israel, which was created by the Balfour Declaration, is the ultimate expression of this imperialist racist ideology, which is why it must be dismantled. What about the Jewish people's right to state it? It doesn't matter. They answer that it can come on the right of the Palestinian rights and a right at the expense of Palestinian rights. These are people that a right that extends from the entire area, from the Mediterranean until the Jordan. And in some cases, they answer even further. The Jews are not a people or a nation, and thus they're not deserving of a state. But we're not going to comment now about what's wrong with this view. But the reality is that this is a prevailing philosophy. And they deny hating Jews or Judaism. They claim that they're only opposed to the Jewish state because it's robbing indigenous Palestinians of their land, violating their rights. And Jews are all welcome in these movements as long as they denounce the Jewish people's right to the land of Israel. And once they do that, they're accepted with open arms. This is nothing new. This has been around in the time of Antiochus in the Hellenist society in the story of Hanukkah. And Jews who join think that they're helping the Jewish people. We can't be and the groups say we can't be anti-Semitic because look, we have Jews amongst us. We love the Jewish people. And so this would all be very painful even if it was focused on Israel, but not uniquely on Israel, but in an even-handed way against everyone. But the reality is that the double standard is glaring. And the question is, what can we do to stop Jews from joining their ranks? One possible way, perhaps, to prevent Jews from joining the ranks of these anti-Semitic groups is to do a better job educating them why Jews have a legitimate right to the land of Israel, to the Holy Land. What is the Jewish claim to the Holy Land? If you can take a moment on page 93, if you have a pen handy, there's 3 options there. If you can take a moment and write what comes to your mind, what is the Jewish right to the land of Israel? And if you feel comfortable, if you can post 1 or 2 reasons in the chat box so we can get some ideas here. God gave it to us, okay? Jews have lived in Israel forever, all right? We were there first. Any other ideas? The Jews fought for it. Thank you. Self-determination. All right, so we have many ideas here. So let's go through some of the most commonly the UN proclaimed it, Hashem said so. Let's go through some of the common reasons and that they've been mentioned here. Most of them have been mentioned here. The first one, which is a very common reason, and that is international law, right? The British conquered Israel from the Ottoman Empire in 1916 and 1917. And the Ottoman Empire was dissolved, and the Balfour Declaration of the British government stated that Her Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. And that followed with the United Nations actually making the partition plan, the League of Nations making the partition plan in 1945, which the Jews accepted and the Arabs did not, and that resulted in the War of Independence in 1948. Right, that's the common thing. And so according to international law, it belongs to us. The UN granted it to us. The Balfour Declaration, the people who owned it granted it to us. So that's the first and a very common reason of what the Jewish claim to Israel is. A second common Jewish claim is Jewish survival. It's crucial to the guarantee of Jewish survival. And that's actually one of the reasons for the modern Zionism is the idea of Jewish survival, especially after Nazism, which tried to destroy and annihilate Judaism, and no one opened their borders for us. Almost no one opened the borders for the Jewish people. And so had we had a homeland, had we had an army that would fight for us, maybe it would look entirely different, right? That's a very common claim, Jewish survival. We need our own place. We cannot rely on anyone else. As a stateless people, we are powerless and dependent on those who hate us, or at best, indifferent to our fate. Therefore, we need a homeland to be capable of defending ourselves. And finally, a third very commonly mentioned reason, which was mentioned here in the chat box, our history. We've been there forever. We've been there. No serious historian would deny that. We've been there for thousands of years. Our entire life is based on Israel. We've never left it. There's always been a Jewish presence. Our historians debate how many Jews were there at all times, but there were always Jews in Israel at all times, and we never gave up hope. We've always prayed for it. We spoke about it. It's in every moment of our waking hour. We speak about it in various prayers, and so it's connected with our history. It's the hopes, the dreams of the Jewish people, even while the large majority of the Jewish people were away from the homeland. Now, these three arguments are strong, and the combination of the three really make for a super strong case. And some suggest that if we did a better job at learning about this and sharing this information with our children and students, along with exposing the hypocrisy and the double standards of the Israeli haters, call out the underlying anti-Semitism motivating them, it would make a huge difference. And at least some of the anti-Israel voices would vanish, amongst them Jews and non-Jews. Now, the truth is there is a lot to like in the above mentioned proposal, and this idea of presenting these three aspects of this proposal. But the reality is that if our education about Israel is limited to these and similar points, we're shortchanging our cause. Because many Jews who express Israel hatred had a relatively strong Israel education. Look at text 5, page 94. It's a quote from a woman, Phyllis Bennis, who is a prominent American Jewish critic of Israel, who seeks to dismantle Israel as a Jewish state, God forbid. She doesn't mention in this op-ed, but she has mentioned it elsewhere. Text 5. Betsy, can you read for us text 5 on page 94?
Okay, I'll try. Let me get it. Hold on a second. Turned off by colonialism. When I was a Jewish kid growing up in suburban Los Angeles, we thought being Jewish meant supporting Israel. There really wasn't a choice. If you identified as Jewish, as I and most of my friends did, the religious education we got, the youth groups we joined, the summer camps where we played were all grounded in one thing. It wasn't Hashem, it was Zionism, the political project of settling Jewish people in Israel. My own break with Zionism came in my mid-20s after reading the letters of Zionism's founder, Theodore Herzl, imploring Cecil Rhodes, the leader of the British land theft in Africa, to support his work in Palestine. Their projects were both something colonial, Herzl assured Rhodes.
Thank you. Phyllis Bennis was raised in an atmosphere in which Israel was a major point of emphasis. She was raised with all the aforementioned points. It's crucial to our survival. It's our history, international law. She was raised with everything, but it didn't endure. It was over when she learned that seeking support from a famous colonist, Theodore Herzl described his Zionist vision as something colonial. And many, many Jews go through the same process. Because when you go through these three arguments, there are very powerful counter arguments. International law. The argument of international law, granted, it may be a sufficient basis in a legal claim, but on a moral claim, those who claim that Israel has no legitimacy to the land of Israel, the Jewish people have no legitimacy to the land of Israel, they say that there was no moral right for the Balfour Declaration. There was no moral right for the UN to give the Jews a homeland in Israel. There was no moral right. It was colonial activity. Jewish survival doesn't have to be in the land of Israel. Jewish survival can be anywhere. As a matter of fact, Theodore Herzl even entertained the idea of Jewish survival in Kenya, in Uganda. Why Israel? And finally, just because someone has a historic connection to the land doesn't grant them eternal rights to the land. Because if you go that route, then maybe we should give New York back to the Dutch. Or perhaps maybe we should give the entirety of the United States back to the indigenous tribes. Maybe we should give Israel back to the Canaanites who lived there before Israel conquered it 3,000 years ago. How about Egypt? Egypt we should give back to the British and before the British. Or whoever was before them, to the Ottoman Empire, before the Ottoman Empire, to the Muslims, before the Muslims, to the Romans, to the Greeks. Where do we stop? Conquering land is part of human nature, is part of history. So just because we've been there for 3,000 years doesn't make it ours. Now, we're not saying that these counter arguments are valid, but the point I'm making is that many Jews do take these positions of these counter arguments. And therefore, if our education rests solely on these 3 points, we're shortchanging our own cause. We need to go further. And the question is what? What is that further step that we have to take? The further step that we have to take is the idea that ultimately every Jew has a flame, a divine spark burning within them. And what I mean by that is as follows. Someone once complained to the Rebbe that there was a Jew who they called in to be a 10th man for the minyan. And he came inside shul, and lo and behold, instead of studying Torah or instead of having a prayer book open, he sat down in shul in synagogue with a newspaper. That's what he was doing. And he was complaining, how could this guy read a newspaper? The Rebbe responded that his perspective in this incident is very different. Let's not focus on why this Jew was reading the newspaper during davening. Because remember, this Jew is there. He's in the synagogue being a 10th man. He's connected to his Judaism. He means it. He wants to be connected. He just doesn't know better. His education was lacking terribly. He doesn't know that it's not befitting to read a newspaper in a synagogue, especially during a minyan. No one ever taught him. And therefore, the Rebbe takes a lesson from the story, and the Rebbe says that's why it's imperative for us to fulfill our responsibility to our fellow Jews, and especially the youth, by providing them with proper Jewish education. And the same idea applies to our topic. Jews who battle with Israel, no matter how much one may disagree with them, they have a neshama. They have a soul, a sacred flame burning within them. When we see them joining anti-Semites, when we see them joining anti-Israel forces and advancing their narrative, we need to explore the possibility that the fault lies with the way they were educated. Let's take Phyllis Bennis, for example. How was she educated? The way I understand it, she was taught that Judaism is all about tikkun olam. Judaism is synonymous with anti-colonialism and with liberalism. That's how she was taught. That's what Judaism is all about. That was the first mistake. Secondly, she was taught about Israel through the lens of Theodor Herzl's project of political Zionism. That's the second mistake. And both these mistakes require rectification in the realm of education. Because Jewish education, proper Jewish education, general Jewish education, not just associated with Israel, not just associated with this narrow topic, but general Jewish education is deserved by each one of our children and our communities, and we must provide it. An education that explores Judaism comprehensively in all its depth and all its splendor from the Torah's point of view. Fine, let Jews conclude that colonialism is evil, but let them come to that decision because of Jewish texts. I'm not saying they will, but if they will, if that's the route they want to go, but let them at least have a true, honest, comprehensive Jewish education. Let it be rooted in faith of God. Because with a proper Jewish education, the lenses with which students will look at the world will be decidedly friendlier towards Israel. And that gets us to the second mistake, second shortcoming. We need to learn ourselves and we need to teach others around us about Israel the way it is presented in the Torah. For starters, this means deepening our appreciation for the concept that Israel is ours because God gave it to us. That's the beginning, the middle, and the end. As Rashi famously states in his first commentary on the Torah, our favorite commentary, the 12th century sage Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, on his first commentary on the Torah, he addresses a very powerful question. And the question is, why is the book of Genesis necessary? The book of Torah is not a historical book. There's no history in the book. Yes, there are certain aspects of this historical part of Judaism, but it isn't a history book, right? Many points of history is missing in the Torah. What is the Torah? It's a book of laws. It's a book of lessons. It's a book of the way we should live our lives. Shouldn't have the Torah began from the beginning of the book of Exodus, the third Torah portion, where we have the first of the commandments? Why does it tell us the whole story, the history of creation? Let's look inside text 6 on page 95. It's a very powerful explanation on why we have that. Phyllis, can you please read for us on page 95, text 6?
Rabbi Yitzhak stated the Torah should have begun with the first mitzvah commanded to the Jewish people, which is contained in the verse, "This month shall be to you," etc. For what purpose does it start with, "In the beginning, Hashem created the heavens and the earth"? The solution is found in the verse. He recounted the strength of his works to his people to give them the inheritance of nations. In other words, if the nations of the world accuse the Jews with the claim, "You are thieves for having conquered the lands of the seven nations," the Jews should reply, "The entire world is Hashem's. He created it and granted it to whomever he desired. It was his will to initially give it to the seven nations, and it was his will to subsequently remove it from them and give it to us."
So 1,000 years ago, Rashi quotes this teaching from the Medrash, which was written hundreds of years earlier. Just as the nation's complaints and protests remained constant and unchanged for thousands of years, so too has the answer to that claim remained unchanged. In the year 1738, before the Common Era, over 3,000 years ago, almost 4,000 years ago, God told Abraham that I am giving you and your descendants this land, as we see in text 7, page 97, the verse in the middle of Genesis. God told Abraham, raise your eyes and look around from where you are to the north, to the south, to the east and the west. All the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. This promise was reiterated time and time again to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to the entirety of the Jewish people. This is the basis for our right to the land of Israel. And that's why the entirety of the book of Genesis is written. It's God's world. God created it, and God can decide who he gives it to. And God decided that that little plot of land called Israel in the Middle East belongs to the Jewish people. It's a gift from God to us, and we cherish that gift with our life, as befits to a gift given to us by God. We hold on to it dearly. So if we raise Jews with little appreciation for the Torah and ambivalence about God, this point will fall flat. That is why we must give the youth and ourselves a rich and robust Jewish education, general Jewish education. In other words, Israel education becomes meaningful when it's built on a strong foundation of Jewish education that presents Torah and Hashem as exciting, relevant, meaningful. Now, would this be an effective argument against the non-Jewish anti-Israel voices? Hopefully. After all, many non-Jews believe in the Torah. And even those who don't respect our position as a deeply held religious conviction, even those who don't accept the Torah will respect our position as a deeply held religious conviction, not as a political position that is subject to change. But that's for the non-Jews. Our main audience is our fellow Jews. And the more we teach it to ourselves, to the Jews we come in contact, to the Jewish youth, the stronger their morale would be, the stronger their commitment would be, the stronger their relationship will be with the land of Israel. As we see in a very powerful letter that the Rebbe wrote in the 60s to the president of Israel, Mr. Zalman Shazar, text 8 on page 98. Dr. Herman, can you read for us, please? Text 8 on page 98.
Just a second. I have received complaints. Why do I invoke the biblical land of Israel, the Holy Land, and the covenant with Abraham in connection with modern Israel? Why do I mix God into the picture? After all, they say, those who fought for the creation of the state, those who led it, those who currently direct it, and its authorized representatives, they all proclaim and take pains to emphasize that Israel is a state founded in 1948. My answer, put frankly, is that their narrative is false. No new entity was created in 1948. Rather, that was the year in which a large part of the land of Israel was liberated. An entity established in 1948 based on the agreement or authorization of the nations of the world has no strength or justification in terms of an authentic response to the claim. You are thieves for having conquered lands belonging to others, etc. A claim raised by the Arabs, the Vatican, the United Nations, and some Jews as well. This is why it is so crucial to underscore that it is our God-given homeland. Now, I do not delude myself into imagining that these just and honest arguments will prevail in the United Nations, the Vatican, etc. Nevertheless, transmitting this truth is critical for the morale of Jewish youth living in the Holy Land, including those serving in the IDF, for Jewish American students, and for the Jewish youth of other countries as well.
Thank you. So when it comes to Jewish education, when it comes to Israel education, we have to make sure that we stress that Israel is not just a land with promise, but it is the promised land. It's ours because there was a covenant between God and Abraham, which is stronger and more important than any international treaty, than anything that the UN will and will not say. It makes no difference. It's ours because God gave it to us. And that is crucial for ensuring that the youth do not get caught up in these anti-Israel sentiments. And just as a side point, these ideas where Torah has a vastly different approach to a modern idea once it's seen from a proper Jewish lens is in a number of instances, not just in the land of Israel, not just the way we see the land of Israel, but a number of instances. One example is in meditation. Meditation is important. Meditation is healthy. Meditation really helps us get in touch with our deeper self. And meditation from a Torah perspective is really the way it ought to be. As a matter of fact, that's the topic of our next course. The winter course, beginning in February, will be on meditation from Sinai and what the Jewish perspective and what is Jewish meditation. But let's get back to our discussion. So we'll conclude with an interesting idea. The question really is, let's get back to text 6, right? The text that we said that the Jewish people, why is Rabbi Yitzchak said, why do we have the entirety of the book of Genesis? And that is because if the nations of the world come and complain to us, you are thieves, this is what we should answer them. But let's take a step back. Why address this question at all? It's not a legitimate question. Do they go to everyone? Do they come to the United States and they say, you guys are thieves? Do they come to England and say, you, the English, you're thieves? Every country in the world, Australia, Turkey, you name it. They're thieves from the people who were there before them. Why are we addressing this question at all? And even if the question which is raised by the nations of the world needs to be addressed, it seems odd for the entirety of the Torah to begin in such a form to address a question from the nations of the world. The whole book of Genesis is to address a question from the nations of the world. Granted, even if you feel it's an important question, stick some verse in the middle of Deuteronomy to answer the question. Why begin the Torah with this question? And the answer to this is a very, very powerful answer. It's succinctly put by Rabbi Sadia Goyen, the great ninth century sage, Babylonian sage, if I'm not mistaken. Babylonian sage, who said, page 100, the Jewish nation is only a nation through its Torah. What was he saying? What is that concept? What is he expressing with that concept? So here's a letter from the Rebbe from the mid-50s, where the Rebbe expounds upon this exact concept. Page 102, text 10. Rachel, can you please read for us? Text 10.
Sure. Text 10 on 102. 101. Oh, 102. Okay. The secret of Jewish immortality. An objective, unprejudiced survey of the long history of our people will at once bring to light the reality that our survival as a nation was not the result of material wealth or physical strength. Even during the most prosperous times under the united monarchy of King Solomon, the Jewish people, as well as its country, were materially insignificant by comparison with contemporary world empires such as Egypt, Assyria, and Babylonia. Nor was it our active statehood or the control of our geographic homeland that secured our existence, as is evidenced from the reality that for the vast majority of our history, our people have lived in exile, without a kingdom and without a homeland. Similarly, our Hebrew language did not play a vital role in our perpetuation, for even in biblical times, Aramaic supplanted the Holy Tongue as the spoken language, to the extent that parts of the scripture, almost all of our Babylonian Talmud, the Zohar, and other key works were composed in Aramaic instead of Hebrew. Later, in the times of Rabbi Sadia Gaon and Maimonides, most of the Jewish masses spoke Arabic, and further down the line, it was Yiddish and other languages. It is also impossible to ascribe any common secular culture or contemporary scientific knowledge as a major preservation factor for our people, since such matters morphed radically from one era to another. The only remaining consideration, which is the sole factor that has remained consistent throughout the ages in all lands and under the fullest diversity of circumstance, is the Torah and mitzvot that the Jews have observed in their daily life with great self-sacrifice.
Thank you. The unifying factor that makes us into a people and has preserved us through thick and thin for thousands of years is our Torah. Of course, that doesn't mean that someone who doesn't fulfill the Torah, someone who isn't observant, is any less Jewish, God forbid. The Torah says that a Jew remains a Jew no matter what. What these texts are saying is something very powerful, and that is our identity as a nation is shaped by the Torah, and it alone is the guarantee for our continued existence as a people. But if that's the case, we don't need a geographical location. We don't need a geographical stretch of land to make and preserve us as a nation, which is a great concept, but that is the basis of the question. You see, as we explained the last lesson, every single concept in the world has an underlying deep reason for it. And so the underlying reason why the nations of the world are asking or saying that we are thieves, they're saying we are thieves because, hey, you don't need a plot of land. You don't need a geographical space to call home. Home is your Torah. That's what makes you a nation. That's what keeps you going for thousands of years. You don't need a plot of land. And as a matter of fact, they say other nations need land because other nations don't have the Torah and other nations need land. And that's what makes them a national, creates their national identity. Jews don't need a land. We're a nation without it. In fact, having land seems to turn us away from our spiritual identity. This is a spiritual way of explaining why that throughout the ages, down to this day, non-Jews have protested against our possession of the Holy Land. Obviously, it's not the reason they know, but this is the subconscious spiritual background to it. Why God allows such a question in the world, because the basis of the question, there is a kernel of truth to it. Why do we need a land? And the answer is as follows. Judaism is different than any other religion. Judaism is an action-based religion. It's a material-focused religion. God tells us that we are here with a mission. The Jewish people have a spiritual mission. And what is the Jewish people's spiritual mission? To elevate the materialistic world, the physical world, and make it a place to reveal the divinity within it. As we explained in the spring lesson of This Can Happen regarding the spring course of This Can Happen regarding the coming of Mashiach, what our mission is as a people. Our mission as a people is to reveal the divine essence in every single materialistic physical object, which is why Judaism has so many physical commandments. The commandments are all connected with something tangible, with something physical. And that's why God granted us a parcel of land. And a parcel of land that has special laws associated with it, because this provides the Jewish people with an abundance of mitzvahs that can be exclusively performed with land. In other words, expressing the spiritual mission of the Jewish people to elevate the very land, the tangible, physical land, to spirituality, to godliness. And it's this reason why the Torah begins with this answer, because that's really the mission of the entire Torah. The reason why we were granted a parcel of land by God was in order to teach us this spiritual mission, is to take the physical land, and by doing the commandments associated with the physical land, revealing the divinity within the physical land, to engage within materialism throughout the world. And therefore, it doesn't matter how many Jews live in Israel or how many Jews don't live in Israel. It doesn't matter what the policies of the Israeli government are. It doesn't matter what the policies of the Israeli government isn't. It doesn't matter if the Jews exert control over Israel or don't exert control over Israel. What matters is that God gave us this land. It belongs to us. And the reason why God gave us this land is in order to underscore our mission in the world, or it underscores the mission in the world, which is to reveal divinity in the world, and in turn to bring about the change of the entire world, which ultimately will be at the time when we'll actually see it, when all the haters will stop hating, when all the hate will be done away with the coming of Mashiach. May it be speedily in our days. We'll conclude with the lesson video, synopsis of today's lesson, and then we will go to questions and answers.
Lesson 3, The Promised Land. 1. Anti-Semitism seeks legitimacy from the most prestigious authority of any given era. At present, this authority is the pursuit of human rights. Consequently, many of today's anti-Semites focus overwhelmingly on Israel and accuse it of being the ultimate violator of human rights. 2. When Israel is A, demonized, or B, judged with a double standard, or C, when Israel's existence is delegitimized, that challenge exposes itself as an expression of anti-Semitism. 3. When anti-Semites refrain from asserting that they seek to annihilate Jewry, but merely take issue with specific Jewish beliefs or practices, claiming them to be barbaric, Jews can be tempted to join the fight against their fellow Jews, believing that they are saving Jews rather than hurting them. 4. There are several arguments for why Jews need and have a right to Israel. Most crucial is the Torah's oft-reiterated reminder that God gave Jews the land of Israel as an eternal inheritance. The deeper our appreciation of this reality, and the more we educate the next generation about its implications, the more support we will nourish toward the land of Israel. Such an approach can desirably influence the wider audience, but the most vital audience is our Jewish brothers and sisters. 5. To support Torah and God-based reasoning, it is necessary to create an environment that cherishes the Torah and nurtures faith. It is therefore critical to provide a robust Jewish education to ourselves and to the next generation. 6. Jews are a nation not because of our land, but because of our Torah. Nevertheless, the land is important to the Torah's vision for the world, inasmuch as it embodies the Jewish mission on earth, to infuse physicality with holiness.